All right. I've had a lot of students from Pakistan, but I've never actually talked to anybody directly in Pakistan, strangely. Anyway, you asked me to talk about, now this is a really difficult topic for all students, not just students, for everybody, I guess, is how to write well, and particularly in terms of the research. Unfortunately, I will not be able, at the end of this, I will not be able to tell you, I guess like a recipe how to write, but I can only tell you what you need to do to write well. And you're probably not going to like the message, because all I'm trying to tell you is there is no easy way out. There's only a hard way. All right. Let me just go to the slide. Anyway, this is QUT. That's the university I'm from in Brisbane, Queensland, Australia. Yeah, you've probably never been there. It's a nice place. So why do we want to write, or why do you have to write a thesis? Why can't you just do it orally? Now, obviously, there are many reasons you can't do that orally, because you wouldn't be able to remember all the words. But there are two really important reasons why you need to write, and you need to write well. And that's the first one, is to help you think clearly. That's the most difficult part, or that's the most beneficial part. The second one is actually how to communicate information. So if you can't write, you can't communicate, which means you can't pass information, new information that you've may come up with, to others. So clearly, both of them are very important. But the one we're struggling with most, of course, is how to think clearly. So I'll give you some ideas later of how you can become more clear in your thinking. So how to write. So that's really the title, isn't it? So unfortunately, like I said, I can't tell you how to write, because the only way to know how to write is actually for you doing it, practicing. I guess like so many difficult things in life, the only way to really learn how to do or obtain those skills is to actually practice. So what I can do for you, instead of telling you how to write or giving you the advice, is to tell you that you need to write. Yeah? And the reason you need to write is because you need to write what you're thinking. So good writing, by definition, means good thinking. So if you want to ask me how to write, then the question should really be, how can I think clearly? How can I think well? That's the challenge. And it is not an easy one to accomplish. So just to scale you a little bit of the cons, so the consequences of not using good thinking in your writing, which means not good writing. So there are quite a few, and the worst one, of course, is the last one, in particular when you're looking for a job. So not using good thinking in your writing leads to poor understanding of the topic, which leads to poor research questions, which leads to poor contributions to the literature, which leads to, even I suffer from this, journal rejections, which leads to, obviously, you either lose your job or you won't be able to find a job in academia. So poor job prospects. So everything starts with really the ability to think very, very clearly. If you skip that part, nothing good will come, except, of course, by chance. So this goes back to David McCullough. I don't know if you know about this guy. He's got many prizes for writing. So he's actually a history writer. He wrote hundreds of books. So this is a quote from him. So obviously he's written many books, so he would know what writing is all about. So he says, writing is thinking. To write well is to think clearly about complex matters. That's why it's so hard to think. Oh, sorry, that's why it's so hard to write. So, and it goes back to many writers who are very famous ones in America or whatever. They all come up with the same advice. And they all struggle, of course, with writing, even though they've written many, many books. And the problem there is, of course, they don't really necessarily know much about the topic. So the key to writing, and it doesn't matter what you write about, is to first of all know the topic. Yeah. So if you understand the topic, you can write about it quite easily. But you can't do that if you don't have a good understanding of the topic. So clear thinking, what does it actually mean? Now, clear thinking requires critical thinking. Critical thinking, yeah, you know about this if you're a teacher, because you get your students to critically think, although you do know that very few students are capable of doing so. So critical thinking requires a different type of thinking, which is actually called reflective thinking. I don't know if you've heard of that. So the more complex the problems you're trying to understand, and in particular, I don't know where you're all from, but if you're in finance or in social sciences, most problems are very complex. And the reason they're complex is because they deal with human behavior. And human behavior always changes. So I'm from science originally. I did a PhD in engineering too. And I really didn't have to think much critically there. I just did things. I observed things and then I just did them through experimentation. But in social science, it's a lot more complex for many reasons we'll explain later on. But certainly the more complex the problem, the more thinking is required. So the unfortunate thing, you know, I've supervised probably more than 100 students in the PhD. The one they all lack, and also through the journey of 3 years or 4 years of PhD, it's very difficult to advance. But certainly what is lacking the most is their ability or their understanding, their appreciation that to do well and to write a good thesis and to get things published in good journals, it's critical for you to actually be able to think very clearly about a difficult topic. So what is reflective thinking? That's the most important thing, or the most important type of critical thinking required to be able to write. So reflective thinking about a concept, so any concept in finance, if it's corporate social responsibility or anything in economics or wherever you come from, it involves consideration of the larger context. So rather than, and that's what most people do, rather than just write what you read or what you read, yeah? So you just read things and then you copy and paste it and put it into your thesis, you actually have to understand or try to consider why what you've read matters. So the why is more important rather than what. It's not what they did, but why did they do that? Yeah. So when you ask the question why, you refer to the meaning. Something, yeah, it connects to something in the real world. Yeah, so that's what I talk about is the larger context. So instead of, for example, finding out or what it is, you need to find out so what. So if they did something in the paper, you got to ask yourself, so why did they actually do that? So what is active thinking. What is passive thinking, because all you do is just copy and paste. Yeah. So what most students or most people do is the passive thinking rather than the active thinking. So reflective thinking is an active thinking activity. Yeah. And what you need to do in the active thinking, yeah, so what, answer those questions, is to actually make judgments all the time. So you have to judge, yeah, what you've read in terms of its value. Without judgment, you cannot get good understanding, or it's highly unlikely. If you have poor understanding, again, you can't write well. So the judgment, rather than saying what it is and writing that down, you need to question, reflect on it, and ask yourself, so what? So why? Why is this important? Yeah. So it has to connect to something, to a problem that you're trying to solve. The real world, you know, most people complain about academia, nothing to do with the real world. Yeah, now that's probably one of the reasons. Yeah. And then it comes to the question about what are you going to write about? Yeah. And that's often asked from students. Yeah, they ask me, what should I write about in my thesis? Yeah, the concept or the problem. And I always say to students, it actually doesn't matter. If you're really curious, if you really want to be a scholar, yeah, and if you're really curious about life, wanting to find out how the world works, then it actually doesn't matter what topic or what problem you're dealing with. Yeah? Because for a curious person, almost everything is interesting as long as you think about it hard enough. Yeah? As long as you understand it well enough. If you understand something well enough, it doesn't really matter what the topic you're going to follow. Yeah. So don't ask the question to your supervisor, what shall I write about? Yeah. Just pick any topic. I always see this as kids going to a candy store, yeah? Oh, that was in the early years, yeah? Maybe 20, 30 years ago, when they did have candy stores. Maybe in Pakistan they still have. And you bring your kid there, and he would stand there for hours and hours because he couldn't make up his mind which Snoopy or which sweets to buy. But in fact, it doesn't really matter. They're all full of sugar anyway. So really, deep down, they all have something instinct. Yeah, so it doesn't really matter which topic. Now, of course, when you talk about publication, see, I'm not here necessarily telling you that you should be basing your PhD on what you can publish, but that's not really my interest, because I think publication will be that, you know, publishing many papers. Most universities all around the world are moving away from quantity, just all about quality now, maybe 1 or 2 papers every few years. So it doesn't really matter too much. But if you're interested in, of course, getting lots published, then you maybe have to consider a little bit about focusing on topics that are still relevant in 3 or 4 or 5 years. Yeah, that's how long it takes to get your PhD done and to get it published. So think about what's something that will still be topical. So if you still talk about the GFC, it's probably very difficult to get published. COVID, maybe that's also a little bit too late already. But CSR or climate change and how we integrate that in economic and finance, yeah, how to value these things, that will be something for the next, say, 5 to 10 years. That's not going to go away. The other thing is, and I guess this, I'm not here making a distinction between the different types of inferences, yeah, either deductive or inductive, but you cannot have any thought without inference. So inference is the process of course, reasoning, yeah? So thought is all that stuff that happens in your head. And I always tell students, if your head is not hurting, you're not thinking hard enough. Yeah, you know when it gets hot here, your head gets hot. That means you're actually actively engaging in an active process of reasoning. So inferences is all about reasoning, irrespective if it's deductive or inductive, yeah? So it's all about coming up with some sort of an idea, a suggestion, and a hypothesis, yeah, or a possible solution to a problem. That's really the key activity that you will be engaged in when you will be doing your PhD, or you're probably already doing your PhD, yeah? So reasoning is the key component of, I guess, all intelligent action, yeah? The only problem, of course, with thinking about ideas or inference is that you can't do that with an empty mind. Yeah? So no ideas will pop into an empty mind. So you need to fill up your mind or your head or whatever that stores the knowledge. Yeah? So nothing good comes from nothing. It can only come from something. So the key now will be you need to stuff your head full with lots of information. Yeah? So inference, reasoning needs facts. Yeah? So great ideas come from great questions. Great questions do not come from nothing, from empty minds. Great questions and facts are highly correlated. So knowledge and questioning, knowledge and ideas, good ideas, are highly correlated. So you do need to read, and read. And that is one problem. I don't know, maybe your country is all different. But in the countries that I've been in, the Western countries, I can tell you, virtually nobody reads. And if they read something, it cannot be longer than a few lines. They read it from the internet. And when they read articles, they just read the abstract, or just the title, or they just read it from another paper which summarizes some of the content of another paper. Yeah, but I'm not just talking about articles. I'm actually also talking about books. You know, there are wonderful books written, and many books, you know, they're at least 100 years old. When all these ideas started, the literature has moved on so much. So many people have done research on certain topics that people don't tend to go back to when it started. The other day I was reading a book from 1937. That was the first time somebody wrote about valuation or the discounting. And I read that book rather than reading the textbook books which are current today, which is just, you know, digested material. When you go back to the original book, what is most interesting, when people wrote in those times, they were so honest about writing. They just wrote what they were thinking. They had a dialogue, a story. And I think all that sort of good writing is gone. So when I read that book, I had actually a much better understanding actually of discounting. And I think we misinterpret discounting. Yeah, discounting is when you put a low value on something further into the future, which is a very important concept in finance. But after reading that book, I had a much better understanding of discounting. And I could tell my students that I can write better papers about it now. For the fact, just because I've actually read that book. Yeah. So I've got probably about 800 books. I read about 2 or 3 books every day and just read the whole time. And it is important to read many, many books, because the more knowledge you have, yeah, the better ideas you can come up with. Yeah. If you've got an empty mind or a half empty mind, it just doesn't happen. It will not happen. It just can't come from nothing. Yeah. Because if that would be the case, then little children have a better idea or have a better chance of actually coming up with great ideas. Anyway, so great questions require deep understanding of the existing body of knowledge, yeah, which is called the literature. So when you do a PhD, the first thing you do is write about the literature, yeah, and this literature can be very, very extensive, yeah, but unfortunately for you, you do have to read at least the most significant papers, and you have to go back as far as you can, yeah, because all papers were based on earlier papers, yeah. Knowledge is incremental. So deeper understanding requires extensive reading and thought. So just think about it when you start with your PhD, or it doesn't actually have to be a PhD. It's any paper I start on a topic that I'm not very familiar with starts like the one here on the bottom. It's uncertain, I'm perplexed, which means I have no idea. Troublesome, I'm confusing, yeah, and I'm unsettling. So basically that's the state, emotional state you are in when you start doing a PhD. But you know, the idea through that journey, yeah, a PhD or a paper, doesn't matter, is to come up with, or your exit level will be a cleared up, unified, resolved situation at the end, yeah, with the problem being resolved and the questions answered. So Karl Popper, I don't know if you read about Karl Popper, he's a philosopher. He says the purpose of philosophy, yeah, the P in the PhD, Doctor of Philosophy, is to bring clarity to real-world problems. So clearly, clear thinking is a key to achieving your PhD. So how do you acquire knowledge? Now that is really tough because it can swallow an enormous amount of your time. Yeah? So this is the picture I usually show students. It's this guy peeling an onion. So basically what you need to do, you need to peel the layers, yeah, of knowledge on that particular concept. And I don't know if you peeled an onion before, but the more you start peeling, the more you start to cry. So yes, acquiring knowledge will make you cry. It is very frustrating. It will make you confused and more confused in the beginning. But eventually, and I'll show you how to get to that, eventually it should get you to a state of clarity. I mean, that's the objective. If you cannot achieve that, you shouldn't really do a PhD, or you shouldn't have a PhD. So when you read the literature, this is what's going to happen in your head. And this happens to me all the time. This is a drawing from a little baby or a kid. Yeah, this is what they do when they're confused about the real world. So you know, your parents ask, can you draw something about, you know, the neighborhood? And this is how it ends up to be. Completely confused. Yeah, and I call this complex. Yeah, so the literature is by definition, particularly in social science, highly complex. Yeah, because we're dealing with very complex concepts. Concept like corporate social responsibility is actually really complex. You know, when you think about it first, or you talk about valuation. Valuation, you know, asset valuation is actually very complex. Anything in finance, yeah, corporate governance is actually really, really complex, and it's partly complex because you're going to start to reach a state of information overload, which means your head has started to crack. It cannot absorb anymore. Yeah. So complexity, according to Edgar Morin, which is actually a philosopher in complexity theory, he said complexity is a problem word, not a solution word. So complexity is a problem. And that's a problem you have to deal with. If you cannot deal with complexity, you cannot get clarity. So the question now is, how do you deal with complexity? Now, these are two of my most favorite people, or philosophers. Both are dead, but luckily they left lots of YouTube videos and lots of books for us to read. So we can still not necessarily have a conversation with them, but certainly get information about how they think about life. Yeah. So the first guy is Minsky. And Minsky is a professor, or was a professor at Princeton University. He tried to build AI, or artificial intelligence. He tried to build computers which can think like we think. But to do so, he has to work out how we think. So he spent his whole very, very long life to figure out how we think. Yeah. Now, interesting, Marvin Minsky, he's dead, but his body is still intact. They've actually frozen him, cryogenic freezing. So he's being frozen in carbon dioxide. And he might come back maybe one day when they find a solution or a cure to his disease. But he's still intact physically, at least, but not in mind. The second one is Feynman, Richard Feynman. I don't know if you heard of Feynman. Feynman is a really good philosopher. He got a Nobel Prize in quantum physics many, many years ago. And he always writes wonderful articles about how to think. So he's a really good teacher, or he was. And again, lots of YouTube videos about him. And, you know, it's wonderful to listen to those people because they're trying to work out how to think better and how to think clear. So what they try to tell us is you must make the complex simple. Yeah, as simple as possible, but not too simple. Yeah, if you make it simpler than simple, then of course the value is gone. So it is a critical point that you have to reach. So this is actually Marvin Minsky's quote. And that quote is with respect to how to think clearly. So he says, everything is similar if you're willing to look far out of focus. So basically what he's saying is, if everything gets really complex, what you need to do, you need to stand further away. When you stand further away, the detail will disappear. The context will disappear. And all you see is the big, you know, the big words. And that's really what you need to do. And he gives you an example, or he gives plenty of examples how to do so. And I'll go through that a little bit here. Yeah, so he says, basically, or he has a method for organizing knowledge. And this knowledge, yeah, the literature, has to be organized in a hierarchical way, which means, you know, there is a levels. Yeah, you get the highest level and then lower levels. So he says you need to organize the literature in terms of its hierarchy, yeah? What is more prevalent and what is less. Because if you can't do so, you cannot solve complex problems. All problems in finance are complex. So he says you have to reduce the problem space to its essence. So the essence mean to the most common element. That's something that you can't get rid of, that word, yeah? Because it is integral to that concept. Yeah? And if you do not do so, and if you keep all the other information and other words, then unfortunately it's going to entangle you. When something entangles you, it's basically you're going to get caught up in the web and you can't get out. And that's not a good thing, because when you get caught in the web, it is, unless you get someone to help you, you're basically going to perish. Yeah, and that is the time, usually after about 1 year. The first year in PhD is easier because, okay, you don't have overload yet. But after about 1 year, you can see this with all students. You start to go downhill psychologically, yeah? And you reach your low point. Now, a lot of students after that either don't continue or, you know, they take some leave. But, you know, you don't want to get into that situation. But that's the situation when they're starting to get caught up in the web. It's just all too much. So clearly they haven't followed these rules. Yeah. Anyway, so what Minsky says, you need to aggregate, combine the information, the literature, into rich yet manageable chunks. Chunks means large components. Yeah. from which meaning can be derived. Yeah, so that goes back to reflective thinking or judgment. You have to derive meaning. What is this all about? What does it mean? That is the questions you have to always keep in mind. If you forget that, yeah, just get a piece of paper and put it above your desk. Once you forget that, you will get lost, because then all you do is focus on what is. So he calls this the DNA of the concept. Yeah? So DNA, I'm sure you're familiar with it, is the makeup of the genetics of, say, any species, humans or whatever. So he says the first step to clear thinking is to create a frame for the problem space. So what you need to do is a frame is just a sum or a number of objects. Yeah, so DNA is the frame, and the DNA composes of the RNAs, yeah, the small components, and it has to be in the right sequence. So these are the words, the key words, yeah, the stereotype words that you associate with that concept, and I'll give you some examples of that. So the DNA is the language of the concept. So everything that Minsky talks about is all semantic. It's all about the meaning, yeah, and the meaning of words. So I'll give you some examples here of, say, a learner. So the frame, so the concept is a learner, yeah? So the frame is a learner. So what are the objects, invariant objects, which means what doesn't change, yeah, which is associated, what are the words associated always with a learner? Yeah, say, for example, a PhD student, hopefully. So it's persistence or persistent, a listener, yeah, open-minded, a thinker, a writer, and curious or curiosity. So these are the 5 objects, invariant objects, because they are always associated with the learner. So if I want to ask you, can you give me a description of a learner? All you need to remember is those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So when you see a person and it doesn't have those 5 characteristics, then you know it's not a learner. See how easy it is to understand things? Another one here for a Dutch person. Yeah, I'm from Holland originally. So what's a Dutch person? Yeah, in terms of personality or characteristics. Yeah, the culture. Now the Dutch people are very direct, so it can be quite offensive, like myself. Open-minded, pragmatic, which means they're willing to compromise. Social, and industrious or hardworking. These are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 characteristics, yeah, invariant objects of a Dutch person. So when you see a person, so these are generalizations, yeah. So when you see a person, you want to work out, is this person likely to be Dutch or not? Yeah. So if you want to understand this person, all you need to know is whether or not he's Dutch. Once you know he's Dutch, you know a lot of characteristics. You already understand to some degree that person. Yeah. Of course, there are variations, but I'm talking here about the very abstract knowledge. Yeah? Something that almost is invariant across all Dutch people. Another one may be closer to home. I didn't do a Pakistani person because I don't have any knowledge of your culture, but I should have looked it up. But I guess you're probably better in answering that one. Another one's for sustainability. So that's a difficult concept in economics. Yeah? So you might not agree, of course, with the objects, and that's fine because, it takes time to come up with the right DNA. Yeah? You can't just find it immediately. Yeah, and if you think that something is not invariant because that word doesn't apply to all, then you should remove it. So, for example, sustainability is about, I think most people would agree, is stakeholders, impact, value, compliance, responsibility, and say climate. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if you want to understand the concept of sustainability, then really you have to focus on those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 objects. So that actually summarizes, to some degree, the literature or the knowledge we have about the concept of, say, sustainability. Give you 2 more examples here. This is one I used all the time when I teach risk management. It's nothing to do with options and stuff like that. It has to do with actual risk and uncertainty, yeah? The Nietzschean type of approach I take. Or if you're more familiar with Nassim Taleb, that sort of approach. It's about the meaning rather than just doing, yeah? How to buy an option or how to say manage a portfolio of risk. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what does it actually mean. So risk management system, for example, has invariant object of appetite, appetite, representation, quantification, and implementation. Just by those 1, 2, 3, 4 concepts or 4 objects, I can teach a whole unit of risk management. And that's what I do, and I've done it for 10 years. Yeah, and this is not low level, it's relatively high level, because it talks again about meaning, yeah? It's the critical component of thinking. Another one for corporate intelligence. So the intelligence system of a company, say. So the objects here I came up with is resources, information structure, goals, and mission. So if you want to understand a company and you want to do evaluation of a company, those 1, 2, 3, 4 objects, invariant objects, which are invariant across all corporations, will basically help you substantially to do the evaluation, because you can actually now understand how a corporation works, yeah, which is of course essential in terms of finding out the risks and opportunities, yeah, for a corporation. Now, of course, the words themselves doesn't give you understanding, yeah? It's just like, you know, words in a dictionary. If you read a word, it doesn't mean anything. So to get meaning, you need to put words together in a sentence, yeah? So when we talk about the sort of sketching approach that I'm doing here, we need to create some sort of a structure. So which means we need to draw arrows, yeah? So to get meaning of the concept, yeah, the frame, risk management or whatever you're interested in or you're studying, you need to connect, you need to draw arrows between those objects, because if you don't draw arrows, nothing is learned. Yeah, nothing is learned. So you need to connect them together. So the purpose here of learning, of understanding the concept would be to find the connections. That is not that easy to do. You need to find out how they connect together. Once you find connections, information will flow, yeah? It's like the electron. Information is something that flows. And if you're in electrical engineering, you would understand that concept, yeah? Information has to flow, yeah? Just like finance relative to economics. Finance is about the flow of money. It's not about the structure, yeah? That's economics. So information has to flow between the objects. Once information flows, you gain understanding and you get meaning, yeah? And particularly when you then apply it to a specific context, yeah? Any context, you know, any particular firm or country, whatever you do. If you, yeah, so to connect them, yeah, requires reasoning. So you need to start to think about why they connected, why they're not connected, and how they're connected. Yeah, so that is, it goes back to the argument of inference, yeah? And once you start to think about the connections, you're already coming up with lots of research questions. Yeah, and what is most interesting, visually, this happens to me all the time, I can see things flowing in my head. So I don't know how that works psychologically, but I can see information flowing and I suddenly start to connect everything in my head. And suddenly my head becomes clearer. Yeah, you have to do it to know it, to see it working. Yeah, you just have to believe now for me, which is not convincing, of course. But if you do it, you will see it happening. All right, sorry. So I'll give you an example here of how I study or how I understand the concept of risk management. Yeah, so this is my connection. So these are the arrows I draw, and I've been doing this to understand banks, very complicated banks like JP Morgan or Mitsubishi Bank, yeah, all those very, very large banks. So we've done this I've done this for years, and it's led to great understanding of the risk management process or how companies manage risk in the real world. Yeah, so we're talking here about meaning. So we talk about the real world. Yeah. So, for example, anything about risk always starts with appetite. Appetite usually starts with culture. Yeah. So from appetite, it follows the representation, because if you've got a higher appetite than another company, you're more likely to deal with uncertainty rather than with risk. Risk and uncertainty have different representations. Yeah. So one follows to the other. And then you get your representation to quantification. Not all representations can be quantified. But different representations, say standard deviation, value at risk, stress testing, or whatever you do, have a different process of quantification. And the quantification, of course, is necessary to implement risk management. Yeah? So quantification goes back to implementation. So once you start to connect those objects, those invariant objects, you start to understand risk management. Now, the most interesting thing of this is that this concept is, this frame is so abstract that in fact, I can apply this, and in fact, I do apply it because most of my students are not from finance. Yeah, they come from engineering, mining, whatever. So they apply actually this one in engineering. So concepts of understanding in engineering can be now transferred to the concept of the understanding of risk management in finance. So now I can access information that is not in my discipline, which I couldn't do before because it was too specific to finance. So you have to make it abstract enough that information from other disciplines, from other knowledge fields can come to your discipline. Yeah, that has been one of the biggest eye-openers for me. Yeah, so that has increased and widened my understanding and deepened my understanding. So that's the process. Yeah, there's another, oh, sorry, I'm not sure what's happening here. This is another one, corporate intelligence, yeah? So this is the one I use for students when we do evaluation. So companies have goals and missions, and they have resources. Without resources, you can't achieve your goals. Forget about the mission, yeah? So if you don't have enough resources, that obviously implies substantial risk. If you set goals which are too high, yeah, or if you set high goals, you must have the resources. If you don't have the resources, you're unlikely to achieve it. So we're looking at the resources of the companies, yeah? And then we make a judgment relative to the goals and where they are today, whether or not they're able to achieve it. So we make judgments all the time. And through the judgment, we come up with numbers and then we do evaluation. Information structure is about, just like you're doing, you need to access information. So you go through journals, say. So where do companies get their information from? Yeah, if they want to achieve a goal, innovate something, how do they do that? Where do they get information to create something like that? Yeah, and then we go really deep into this information structure. Yeah, but this conceptual structure of corporate intelligence, I guess it can be applied to humans, can be applied to any corporation. It doesn't have to be a for-profit one. Yeah, you can also connect frames for meaning, which means you connect different concepts across different areas in finance, which is also very useful. I've only got a really simple one here. So I've got here, for example, the concept or the person is called John. Now we know John as a kid and he has a birthday party. Yeah. Now I can have a frame for kids. So a kid has the object young, play, innocent, and creative. Birthday party, I got the concept or the objects of cake, presents, balloons, and candles. Yeah. And this is invariant across different ages. So I can understand John just by having two frames, kids and birthday party. If I have a frame for kids and birthday party, I can already understand most things about John and in the party. I've got substantial information and understanding. Yeah, that's the idea. Okay, so that's the idea of how to simplify things so that you can think more clearly. Yeah, then you can reason. Once you can reason, you will come up with a really good question. Yeah, So that's more the inductive type of inference. Now, Richard Feynman, yeah, he writes really well, but he writes like a kid, and that's not an insult. That's actually a good thing. What it means is he writes really. Anybody can understand it. You don't have to be a physics graduate or have any particular aptitude towards the exact sciences. So he says, and that's his tip, if you can't explain something in simple terms, you don't understand it. Now, if you teach to students, you would know that. You probably learn more from teaching the students than the students because you start to really understand the concepts, yeah, whatever you teach, when you teach it to others. Yeah, because you know that you have to make it simple. So it's not a new thing that you're not aware of, but you can apply the same in terms of your thesis, yeah, and trying to understand the concept. So this comes down to the method of writing. So he's got 4 steps here. So a lot of my students use those when they write essays or opinion pieces. So one, you identify the subject. And like I said, it doesn't really matter what subject you choose. Second one, teach it to a child, simple and particular short. 3, identify your knowledge gaps, the unknowns. And then 4, organize, simplify, and then tell a story. Yeah? So when you teach, and if you don't teach from the book, you have to tell a story, yeah? Some sort of a moral of the story. And I think a lot of non-Western countries are much better in doing so because they have a much stronger religious background. I think the storytelling is not very strong in the Western world, unfortunately. Yeah, so maybe you do have some advantages here in terms of the writing. So the first thing is identify the object. So all you need to do is start with a blank note and just write absolutely everything you know about it. Just keep writing, yeah? I've used, I don't know if you can see it, this is a notebook. I've got hundreds of these. And not that I go back to them, but I just write everything down. I've always got those with me. And I write everything down that comes into my head. Or what I learn from the television or whatever I do and have a conversation with somebody else. Because this is something I could use later on. Yeah, and if you write it down, it seems to stick with you better. So that's definitely one way. That's maybe something I learned in science. In science, you have to write everything always down, yeah? Just in case you get caught, trapped under a train and people didn't know, you cannot go back and see what you've done. So it's more of an issue of risk management. But anyway, you need to write down all the facts, which obviously means you need to read a lot, yeah? So each time you get some new information, write it down. The second one, which is the trick, is to teach it to a child. So simple and short. So this is almost similar to Minsky. So what you need to do is you need to get a very big felt pen, or I don't know if you still print things. If you don't print things, you just get it on the screen, you can write, yeah? Start to cross out irrelevant stuff or things that is no longer or is superfluous, yeah? It doesn't say anything new. So you have to start deleting things. And I know a lot of people don't like to do that because once I've deleted it, you find it hard to get back. But trust me, you can only go forward. Forget about the past. You've got to go forward, yeah? You've got to trust that it will end up better. So you've got to have confidence that you get into a better place, and you will, yeah? So don't be risk averse when you follow this sort of strategies. Just go for it. Yeah, you will be, I guarantee you will be in a better place as long as you keep going on it. Yeah, so rewrite your notes in very plain terms, which means if you don't understand words, go to the thesaurus on the computer and substitute that, which I do all the time, substitute it for very simple words. You know, particularly in English, if you write in English, I assume you do, and you find some words difficult, just go to the thesaurus and substitute it for the words that you do understand. Because if you have difficult words, yeah, and some people like to write really fancy to impress others, but it's not very helpful to convey information. So keep words very, very simple, yeah? Because it's only better to get more people to understand actually what you've learned rather than less, yeah? We're not here to impress, we're here to transfer information to others. All right, so you have to be brief. So delete, like I said, delete obsolete information, yeah? So cut out as much as you can what is not relevant and see what is left over. Yeah, and then clarify the vague. So if something is not clear, then you write it in. Yeah, if you see there are gaps, then you write it in. I say, I don't understand this. Yeah, so if you teach, you will know this because some students in our country, they don't do because they're too scared to ask stupid questions. Now, I put them between inverted commas because I think there are no such thing as stupid questions. Yeah, actually, these are smart questions. But people are afraid to ask very simple questions because they think that they look stupid. But it's so dumb. You should just ask any question. Yeah? Don't worry about embarrassing yourself because that will only stop you from learning. So try to talk to people like your mother, your father, or your brother, your sister, or your supervisor, if they have time, and just talk about the concept and let them ask lots of questions. Because if you don't have an answer to the question, that clearly means that something you don't understand, and then you write that down. Try to find the answer, go back to the computer and search for the answer. Yeah, you're lucky that you have Google or whatever search engine you use, because in the past, say 20 years ago, we had to go to the library and go and search in the index, and that was an absolute horrible thing. So to get information now and fill in the gaps is much easier than it was in the past. The third one is identify your knowledge gaps. So these are the unknowns. So the unknowns, yeah? The unknowns, the thing you can't think about. So how to know about unknowns? The only way to find out what you don't know is to ask questions. Yeah? So the known unknowns are the questions that you've asked, but you don't know the answer to. To make them into known knowns or knowledge, you need to find the answer. So you go to the internet, yeah? But you can only know knowns, you only get known knowns or the knowns if you ask questions. If you don't ask questions, you cannot increase your knowledge because you don't know what to ask. So the unknowns is what you don't know. So you need to find out what you don't know. The only way to do so is asking yourself lots of questions. Yeah? And then find the answers. And then you will see the gaps are starting to be filled in. Yeah? And you start to get a much better understanding. Yeah? But of course, to ask questions, that involves reflective thinking. You've got to ask yourself, what does it mean? And if you don't know the answer, yeah, then you go and try to find the answer. That's the idea. Anyway, the fourth step is an easy one. You organize it, yeah, you get the sequence right. You simplify again and again and again. And then you just tell a story, yeah. Usually what's left over is a wonderful story. It will all happen automatically. Not necessarily automatically, but certainly after substantial effort, yeah. And that's the wonderful thing. And my suggestion to you is not to write more than 200 words, 200 pages in a thesis. Any thesis longer than that is not a good thesis in my mind. Good theses are short theses. If you go back maybe 30, 40 years, theses were only like 20 or 30 pages. Yeah? Now people go towards 200 or 300. It's absolutely ridiculous. Yeah? It's as if they will have to write about everything, every article that's ever been published. You don't. The idea is here to make it simple, to create a story. Your thesis is a story. See it like a novel. It's your viewpoint of a particular concept, yeah, that you're interested in. It's your viewpoint, and it doesn't have to agree with the literature, yeah? Certainly not. Yeah, because then you can contribute more. So how do you now come up with a good research question? Now, the wonderful thing is here, if you, after this point, don't already have a good question, then what it means is you haven't actually understood the topic well enough. So if you can't come up with a good question, you have to go back and find more information, learn more, simplify more. Eventually the good questions will come. Yeah, because by the definition, because you're asking many questions, those questions which are not answered, which you believe are important, are potential research questions. Yeah, of course it depends on whether or not you've access the information adequately. Yeah. So what's a good research question? You will know it. That's the wonderful part. Yeah. So great research ideas, which are, I guess, answers to the questions or potential answers to the problem, require a leap. Yeah. A jump, a leap of faith. And that goes back to, I can't remember the philosopher. I don't know if it was Popper. I think it was Popper. Correct me if I'm wrong, but he said every great idea should be speculative. Don't come up with too small ideas. If you jump from the known to the unknown is too small, then you're probably not solving the problem big enough. Maybe your question is not big enough. You have to, or the idea is not big enough. Yeah. So your ideas must be speculative, because only by taking a big enough jump are you likely to find something unexpected. Yeah, unexpected knowledge. So you must make sure that you're not asking, or that your idea is not just, I guess the worst thing would be if you just do something what somebody else already done. Yeah, but then you don't need to think, because that's just somebody else's idea. Now in a thesis, it should be your idea, yeah, your contribution. So how do you think about it? What can you add? How are you thinking about it relative to somebody else in a different way? And then you do that. I came up with lots of speculative ideas. Again, to say to you, don't play it safe if you want to learn. Yeah, I've had lots of ideas. Some ideas at the end of the day I realized was a stupid idea, but you know, at the time it looked really good. But then I realized after doing all the work, it didn't really end up in anything, and that's okay, because from failures you can learn. It leads you to a better place. Yeah, Your next idea is going to be better because you learn from it. Yeah. Not every idea you come up with can be publishable, yeah, especially nowadays. So the guiding idea, that is your hypothesis. So limit yourself to just 1 or 2 suggestions. So again, your idea should only be one. If you come up with one idea, that would be amazing. Yeah, one speculative idea, that would be amazing. Nobody asks you to come up with more than one idea, yeah? I've never seen that in a good thesis. So all the other ideas, all the other hypotheses, I've seen theses with papers from students in my university with, say, 20 hypotheses. I mean, every control variable in the regression, they make that into a hypothesis. But that's not your idea, so don't bother about it. Yeah, these are just control variables. Focus, be laser focused on your idea, yeah? On your good idea. So do not bother about having too many hypotheses. You know, just because you got 5 hypotheses or 10 hypotheses and the other one got 2 hypotheses, doesn't mean your thesis is any better. Yeah, it's not about quantity, it's about quality. Okay, the other one is inferences follows a double test. So you have 2 tests you have to perform, yeah, in terms of your idea. And I think the first test is often forgotten about. Yeah, it goes back to inference, and in particular, sometimes inductive or deductive, it doesn't really matter. Even if you use somebody else's theory, you still have to argue. So the first test of knowledge, so there are 2 tests you have to do, yeah, double test for inference, is the test of logic. So whether or not your idea is plausible, not if it's possible, because everything is possible, yeah? But it must be plausible. Plausible means that people can clap for it. Wow, that is a great idea. If they're not clapping, that means they don't think it's plausible. To make something plausible, yeah, it's the test of logic, you need to argue. You need to come up with the argument and reason why you do believe. So that is another part of thinking, yeah? So it's a mental elaboration of the idea or reasoning. And if you cannot make it plausible, then you should modify your idea, yeah, or dump it, whatever. Because if it can't pass the first test, forget about collecting data and do an empirical test, yeah? If it can't pass the first test, there is no point doing an empirical test, yeah? Too often have I seen people starting in a thesis, the first thing they do is collect data and run regressions. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, that is, the whole method is completely wrong. I don't know how they skip everything. I mean, I don't understand that at all. Anyway, there are too many people like that, unfortunately. They shouldn't be doing PhD, maybe not. Or maybe they should be taught better. I don't know. Some people you can't teach, I guess. Every inference must be proven empirically. Yeah. So the second test is the test of strength. Yeah. So that goes in terms of the deductive knowledge, which is more common in social sciences. Yeah. Deductive inference. So you need to collect some data and then test it empirically. Yeah. If you don't find enough evidence that would suggest that maybe your idea wasn't that great. Yeah. But of course, the empirical test, and I'll go through it in a minute, the empirical test itself is not enough. Of course, ideally, if you find some evidence for your idea and convincing enough, then the true test is, of course, a test of a practice, which means that some government or whatever is going to use that knowledge in the real world. Yeah, so that would be the test of practice. That would be the real test. If you can achieve that, that's pretty good. I haven't seen that very often, but that would be wonderful. Yeah. So don't suggest policy implications if you can't pass the 2 tests, and if you don't believe the evidence is substantial enough. You don't need to. Yeah. People say, oh, you have to come up with a policy statement. Nonsense. Because if your evidence is not strong enough and your empirical test fails, then you should not suggest to others to take that idea on board and make decisions on that, yeah, as a possible solution. That would be ridiculous, isn't it? Anyway, the purpose of empirics, of course, is to experimentally corroborate, yeah, or verify the speculative hypothesis. So you need to collect some data. Now, I've talked to this a bit, Ahmed, before. If you've got a really good idea, sometimes it's better to use as much data as possible. So that's why people tend to test it on data which is fairly accurate and it is a large pool of data, which means it's a large sample. If you got bigger sample, you got more degrees of freedom. So that's why most people, particularly in the Western countries, would suggest try to use US data. Now, I've got access to all the US data if anybody needs any good data. Yeah, I don't know if you got it. WRDS, you know, Water and Research Database. So I've got access to the data. So if you don't have access to the data, go and try to work with somebody who's got data. It's not worth using an inferior data, because that would actually, you would undervalue your idea. That's my opinion. Of course, if something is very specific to your country, or you got wonderful data from your country, you can't get it anywhere else, then you should do that. Use your own data. Yeah, but just be a little bit careful on that one. Anyway, some people also get mixed up between the exact sciences and the social sciences. There is a substantial difference between exact science and social science. I know, because I was in the exact sciences. In the exact sciences, almost everything is inductive, while most of the stuff in social science is deductive, yeah? Deductive inference. I believe it should be both. Good research should have be inductive and deductive, yeah? And there are papers in finance, earlier papers. One of them I can remember is Lindner's dividend smoothing paper. He went and observed what managers did. Then he came up with a theory, and then he tested that theory using evidence, yeah, in a large sample. And that sort of papers, they have actually lasted, you know, the evidence has lasted, you know, for 50, 60 years. So these are really good papers. So the best research is really what it does, inductive and deductive. Yeah, so that goes back to Minsky, I guess. Anyway, what is really important to understand is that in the exact sciences, there is not a high degree of uncertainty, although not everyone would necessarily agree. But exact sciences, I worked in it, in chemical engineering, you can isolate all other influences, yeah? By controlling the temperature, the wind, anything. I can control that and then do an experiment just on one factor. And I can find out the cause and effect. So I can test it. And there's almost no uncertainty with the findings. But unfortunately, in the social sciences, we can't separate it, yeah? All the other factors. There are billions of factors which influence the decision, yeah? Or cause and effect. So we run some sort of an OLS regression, which is very inferior. But there's nothing much we can do about it. All I can say to you is be very, very careful. So our inferences, yeah, in particular with respect to the empirical results, should be taken in some degree with a grain of salt, because there is still a high degree of uncertainty. So all you can say in finance is, the data may agree with the model, but the model might not agree with reality, because there is a gap between the model and reality, yeah? Because there is lots of assumptions made with the model. So I always say to my students, see models more like ways of thinking about things rather than actually as the reality. Yeah, unlike, I guess, what they often do in social sciences, in the exact sciences. So you have to be a little bit cautious here. Yeah, the other thing you have to be very cautious with is statistical significance. Now, if you go back to the American Statistical Association, they've written lots of articles and they're trying to change people's mind. They say, do not worry too much or never say statistical significant, because it's not a true act of thinking. They say it's pretty useless. Yeah, so p-values, like I mentioned, only indicate how competitive the data are with a specified statistical model. In fact, it tells you nothing about, or not necessarily anything about, the real world. Yeah, because of the assumptions made. So you have to be very careful with that. I know it's very difficult to change the literature, and particularly when you try to publish it. I tried to publish it once, and I removed all the statistical significance arguments. And then your referee says, you really have to talk about statistical significance. And clearly, if I don't do that, they're going to reject my paper. So sometimes you have to just do it because you can't get it published. But I do know finance is very, very slow in changing. But I do know in the medical sciences and in management, they've already changed their behavior. Yeah, so they look at, say, confidence intervals. They talk about economic effects. That's the next slide. Focus on the economic significance of your results. Economic significance is all about the meaning of your findings, yeah? If you really got something significant to say, it's not because it's statistically significant, it should be because it's economically significant, yeah? P-values tells you nothing. It provides no information about the practical significance. So a trick in finance, and I've seen this at my university and many other universities, is make your sample as big as possible. So when you get US data, they got millions of data points. I mean, it's ridiculous, millions of data points. And they get t-values of something like 10. And they say, look how significant my result is. Now, let me tell you, when you look at their economic significance, all their lines are basically flat, which means the slopes are so flat, yeah, the coefficients are so small, there is absolutely no economic significance. But they profess as if they find something really important, but they found nothing. Yeah, because, you know, the bigger the sample is, the more likely the p-value is going to be large here. That's a trick. Yeah, so in statistics, in some way, you can prove almost anything, but it doesn't mean it's anything significant. And the sad part, of course, again, comes back to the high degree of uncertainty and complexity in finance, and like economics similarly, and I think management and most social sciences, is that unfortunately, most of our statistical significance is not followed by economic significance. And I just did a paper with Ahmed, or he did most of the work, on the impact of females or the gender influence in terms of access to capital. And while we find statistical significance, the economic significance is actually very, very small. So the question then becomes about, if you find no economic significance or very small, how then do you write about that? Yeah, so this goes back to Richard Feynman here in his younger years. Failure to confirm. And he says, as I get older, I realize being wrong isn't a bad thing. Like the teacher in school, it's an opportunity to learn something. So it's an opportunity to learn. So that goes back to, how do you write it up then in a more mature way, yeah? In a more thoughtful way. Now, failure to confirm, which is probably most of our research, yeah, is not failure. Now, the most common thing I've heard with students is, oh, I got the, they have a certain direction of the hypothesis and they find the sign is the wrong way around. And they said, okay, I just changed my hypothesis the other way around. Now I get significance and everything is fine. But that is so stupid. Yeah, and that's a fallacy in thinking. They think that if you don't find significant results, you can't get your PhD. Of course not. That is just nonsense. Yeah? You should not willy-nilly change the direction of your the direction of your hypothesis. If you do so, then by definition, it means that you weren't that convinced to start off with, which means the first test of inference, yeah, of proof is already failed. So you shouldn't have gone on. Yeah? So failure to confirm is not mere failure. It can be highly instructive. Yeah? And the quicker you fail, the more often you fail, the more you learn. I mean, that's what we tend to tell our students, even though our students don't believe in it either. So a person who is really deliberately thinking, yeah, as the type of students that I'm talking about, the ideal PhD student, will learn as much from its failures as from its successes, yeah? So, of course, if you're a non-thinking person, like I just explained with that, or give an example with that student, if you're a non-thinking person, nothing can be learned, because all you do, you just reverse the sign. But it means you really didn't learn anything anyway. Yeah, in fact, you're not thinking at all. So whether or not you get in the right direction, yeah, which your coefficients are either positive or negative in the same direction as your hypothesis, is just blind chance, yeah? It's just by chance. But you're really learning nothing. So success or failure, you would have learned nothing. In fact, you would have wasted your time 3 years, 4 years of a PhD. And I do know, just to give you some confidence, most students are very, very smart when they start to think. The difficulty is how you make them think. That's the key. Yeah. Anyway, failure may indicate what modifications should be introduced on the ideas. So you have to go back to your thinking and say, okay, what am I thinking wrongly? Am I missing some part of information? Yeah. So you can write about all that. Yeah. So you can write about what you learned, about this possibly not happening, and then you maybe give some suggestions of future research, how they can go forward. Yeah, an alternative hypothesis maybe. Yeah, that's basically how you write. All right, sorry, the next one. So the last chapter of your thesis would be conclusion. So a conclusion is not always an easy chapter to write. It's not just cut and paste from the other sections, yeah? So the conclusion is where you now, yeah, you don't do this in the empirics, where you actually, in the empirical section, where you actually make good judgment. So this is now the chapter, and it's not a long one, where you now start to evaluate all the proof, yeah? So you must make a judgment here, which is called the final decision. So that concludes your research question, yeah? It answers your research question. So judging is the part, yeah, is a difficult part of the conclusion. So you need to decide whether or not the idea that you came up with was a sound idea, or is it just fancy, yeah? It wasn't anything, yeah, which is spurious. So you need to do that by going back to your empirical section, yeah, and back to the argument. So again, the double-blinded test, you have to go back to the double test. In particular, the second part, which is your empirical section. You need to now look at all the equations you've run, all the regressions you've run, and all the models you've used. Yeah, and I do know how it works. Some models give you significant results, other models give you no significant results. It all depends how you look at it. So now you have to weigh off the facts and the evidence, and then decide on the evidence. So you need to write about how you weigh those positive and those good results and bad results off to come up with some sort of a conclusion. Now, any good judgment is something that you learn over time. There's no rules or recipe to do so. Yeah, but again, good judgment is about good thinking. The better you think, the better good judgment you can form. Yeah, and the more others would agree. Yeah. All right. Then, of course, in the conclusion, you can write about policy. Yeah. So if you find that it was a sound idea, then you can make a policy suggestion. If you think it was mere fancy, yeah, it's something you hoped for, but it didn't work out, then you should not make a policy implication, because that would be ludicrous, because you're basically leading people on wrong path. All right. There's only one rule. This is the last slide I got for you. And then if you want to ask any questions, please do so. Not that I have any answers, or any comments would be welcome. There's only one golden rule, and again I go back to Richard Feynman. He's got wonderful quotes. These are all ideas from him. So I can't come up with any other rules or any other suggestion than the one he gave. He says you keep on learning and learning, and pretty soon you learn something no one else has learned before, which is your new idea, and that is your contribution. So the best you can do in your thesis or in life is just keep learning. Nobody can ask more from you. Your supervisor cannot ask more from you. It's not your fault when the results don't turn out the way you thought they would turn out to be. Yeah, and it doesn't mean you can't get your PhD. A good PhD, yeah, is a PhD which expresses good thinking. It's a PhD which shows you your journey of how you got to the answer. That's a good PhD. So that's all I can say to you. So I'll stop sharing. If you have any questions. Okay, so there's some questions there. So I start with the last one, or is there only one there? Okay, this is from Yassir Mustafa. Which part of the dissertation should come first if you start writing the dissertation? Now, writing and thinking are the same thing. You'd start day one writing, and it doesn't matter. So follow the Feynman method. If you start with a topic, just write anything. Don't think that the first day what you write is going to go into your PhD. Huh? You don't know that. I always say to students, I give them the outline of the PhD, conclusion, everything is there, the headings. And I say, start writing for number one day. Yeah, you will have to rewrite your thesis hundreds of times. Can't remember the guy now who wrote, Jeffrey Archer. Jeffrey Archer once said, here's the one from All the President's Men, he wrote lots of novels, hundreds. He says, every book he writes hundreds of drafts. Yeah, you can't write from the beginning and it will all be perfect. Because writing is thinking, and thinking takes time. Yeah. So what is the ratio? How to check the authenticity of data sets selected for the empirical test? Yeah, that's a difficult one. Yeah, now people just download data and then they assume everything is fine. Yeah, a lot of data is wrong. Yeah, so this is one problem I've observed with students, even academics. What they do is they keep cleaning the data. And at the end of the data doesn't reflect the population anymore. So you have to be very, very careful when you start to cleanse data. Yeah? Cleanse, which means you get rid of stuff that you don't like, outliers and stuff like that. So you have to be careful why you do that. So again, it comes down to thinking, why are you cleaning your data? Yeah, so there's a lot of questions there. Let me just, thank you for the questions. Yeah, so you need to think carefully about the data set you use. So like I suggested to you, to get good data is important, because if you have rubbish data or data you can't rely on, clearly that's going to affect your conclusions, yeah, your inference. Your inference may not be valid in terms of, it may be not valid in terms of the market that you're focusing on. So if you do stuff about interesting questions, you have general questions about general topics, my suggestion would always be use as much US data as you can, because a lot of people have used the data, so it has been checked very carefully. Don't trust necessarily all financial statement data, yeah? I don't know how bad the data are in Pakistan. I have no idea. Okay, let me just see. So yeah, the PowerPoint slides I've given to Ahmed. If you want the PowerPoint slides, and you can use them for whatever you want to use them, don't ask, you don't have to acknowledge me. You can cut it, whatever. Use it however you want to use it, please. How to check for autistic, that's the question. Questions, okay, sorry, I'm just going through the questions here. How to check, yeah, that's already asked, sorry. What's the ratio of the introduction and literature review to the entire thesis? Yeah, that's a good question. I think what usually happens is, I mean, I don't generally get students to adopt the university type. That's just the way I am. I don't get them to follow this, the very typical setup. Yeah, I know universities provide a way of how you can organize your thesis. So I don't necessarily do it that way. So I don't say students, you have to have a chapter called literature review. I think if you try to mold students into a format, it takes away their ability to think differently. So I don't worry about it, and I don't worry too much about these things. It all depends what sort of story you want to tell. I don't think any chapter should be very long. Any chapter should be maybe 20 pages or 30 pages, and maybe have more chapters. But you know, it all depends of the journey. You know, some chapters in novels, so some books have say 20 chapters, some have 5 chapters. So it all depends. If you think the chapter is too big, then you cut it into pieces. Sometimes cutting it into more pieces makes it clearer. Yeah. So I can't give you an exact answer, because it all depends. But I think if you start to think, you will figure it out yourself. Yeah. All right, another one. Could you please let me know which is the best way to read the article? Oh my God, that's really a difficult question. But okay, I would not spend 6 hours reading an article, because what I would do is I would read, first of all, the most important part of the article is actually not necessarily the abstract, but is the introduction, because there they will tell you why they do what they're doing. Yeah, and they will also tell you the contribution. So initially, when I tried to write down facts or knowledge about the literature, I would not spend hours and hours reading each article, because you also have to think about your time limits. You don't have a lifetime to read all the literature. Just think about, in corporate governance, there are something like 100,000 articles published. If you want to read each article thoroughly, you'll be 1,000 years old when you're finished. It's not going to work. So you have to be practical too. My suggestion is, first of all, to look at the most important articles. And to find the most important articles, usually the most cited ones, would be, there is a software you can download online, you might be aware of. It's called Publish or Perish. Publish or Perish. You can download it online. All you need to put out is software that allows you to search the literature very, very quickly by entering keywords. And then it will print out in an Excel file for you all the articles and the link where you can find them, which have the highest citations. So I would start with those. Yeah, so don't read each article very thoroughly, yeah, because you're getting then information overload very, very early on. But when you start reading the articles, start to form those objects, yeah, the concepts or the generalized objects, words that you can find in every article. That would be helpful. Yeah. Yeah, okay, so that's the answer to that one. Could you please let me know which one that's asked before? Sorry, I'm just going through it. How do we move from PhD proposal to PhD writing? Yeah, I don't understand that question. PhD proposal, so you have a PhD proposal. Is that what you need? You can talk if you want. Is that what you have to hand in beforehand, before you start a PhD? Yeah? Look, the way I see it this way, people come up with a PhD proposal to get into the PhD program, yeah? Then what I usually do is I just get rid of the proposal and start from fresh and say, let's talk and see what, you know, what interests us and we really like to write something about, a topic. So I'm not too tied up about, I mean, not me, but generally, I don't think it's that important to necessarily follow that proposal that got you into the PhD program. But again, that depends on the university. But the way to move on is to start exactly the Feynman method. Start to write down everything you know. Acquire knowledge, because without that, you can't go forward. Yeah, you can't come up with ideas unless you understand the literature. So literature, knowledge creation, yeah, understanding the literature is the first step. Yeah. Oh, he's writing the you're writing. Okay, this is Huma. She's writing the conclusion of a thesis, but I think it's most difficult chapter. Yeah, I'm not sure why you say it's the most. It needs enough time. Yeah, maybe it's because, I don't know. Shouldn't be the most difficult part in the sense, yes, you must make a judgment. So how do you judge whether or not you actually answer the question, yeah? Or whether you find something new? Yeah, it does maybe require you to go back to your chapters and fix those up. Because you don't know what to conclude. If you follow the steps and you understand the research process, your idea, your question, your idea, and then your tests, the conclusion should be about your judgment, whether or not you've satisfied, yeah, the test, the double test in terms of, you know, whether or not your idea was a sound one. And if you believe that you're confused, then my suggestion before you hand it in, go back to your thesis and start to think about how you can make it simpler or clearer. Yeah, that's what I would do. But I haven't seen your thesis, so I can't say exactly. Plagiarism. This is for Inifix. Plagiarism is really annoying. No, it's not. I can tell you what plagiarism. I've never worried about plagiarism, but I can tell you why. The first thing I always do when I study something new, I get, you know, the articles, and then I highlight the section that I find is interesting, and then I copy and paste it. I'm the worst plagiarism person. But I don't publish plagiarized stuff, so I copy and paste it into my notes, yeah, rather than writing by hand. And then over time, this is just for me to summarize what these articles do. And then over time, this will all be changing because this is just to write down what I know, what others have said, say, and my comments about what I think, what it means. So plagiarism there will be no plagiarism if you follow the process because it will be your story. So I wouldn't worry about it at all. But if you only write down what others did, then sure, you have a serious problem. Because that's not really the purpose of a literature review or of a thesis. You need to write, yeah, what it all means, what you think it all means. So if you've got a problem with plagiarism, yeah, you need to fix it. Yeah, unfortunately. We have to get better sentence getting. Now, yeah. What is the best way or website to get better? No, there is no such thing. There is no website that tells you how to write. Yeah, it's like a cookbook. You want a cookbook. I thought about it the same when I did my PhD. Is there a book that tells me how to write? No. There is no book. There is a book on how to think better. There are lots of books. If you want that book, you email me and I'll send it to you. Ask Ahmed for my email address. And I'll send you some books about how to think better. The two persons I just talked about, one of them is Marvin Minsky, the other one is Richard Feynman. They only talk about how to think better. If you know how to think better, you can write better. It's that simple. There is no magic. If you can't think well, you can't write well. Yeah, because the writing has to come from your head. If it comes out of your head, it can't be plagiarized because it comes from you. That's your contribution. If you don't do that, you're not making a contribution. You shouldn't get your PhD. Review papers, yes, review papers are useful, particularly meta-analysis, because what the meta-analysis does, it analyzes all the papers together and try to see what all of them, the overall evidence provides, what the overall evidence is across all these papers. Yeah, so reviews are very useful, but again, you have to be careful not to plagiarize that, because this is what they think. And the problem with review papers, if you start with a review paper is, then what they think, it becomes what you think. It's best not to be too influenced by what other people think, because if they push you in one direction, it's really hard to not get trapped. That's what I find. So it's something better not to. Thank you, Julia. Okay, okay, that's it. Is there any other question? All right. Oh, so many questions. Publish an article in Scopus is very difficult. How do we get an article? Oh God. Got to how get it? Yeah. Okay. I have to. Everybody has the same problem. The problem with publishing is not as simple as you. It's not necessarily anything to do with you. That's the problem. Sometimes and often, and particularly nowadays, with so many journals asking you to review papers because they find it hard to get people to review, particularly since the COVID, you get so many bad reviewers. Stupid questions. I had one, or stupid suggestion. I had one rejected a paper because he says you have to remove all reference to a human. It should be like in science. It's like no human exists. I mean, nonsense. When I write, I either write I or we. I mean, it's ridiculous. Unfortunately, yeah. So it is the draw of it's the draw of the luck. Yeah, the luck. You have to have luck. Yeah. Although I must say, if you don't write well, then that's one big reason for getting rejected, even in good bad journals. So if you write well, your chances of getting a resubmission is quite high. Yeah. So that it only helps you writing well. Yeah. So you got to think about why you get rejected. It could be that contribution is not enough or whatever. Sometimes you can fix it up by good writing. Okay. And you can still pass it or get in. Oh, sorry, your face, you're right. Oh, okay. We all watch Ceiling. Oh, sorry about that. Oh, you should have said that to you, man. Sorry. I didn't know you saw the Ceiling fan. Yeah, I'm terribly sorry about that. This chair, I feel like I'm falling down. It must be another reason. Okay, anything else? Let me have a quick look. Okay. Well, this peer review, yeah. Peer feedback play in the writing process. Ooh, yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. The question is, can you find somebody who's willing to spend time on you? That's really difficult. I find it difficult to find people who want to give you honest advice. Usually you just get a few, easy, lazy comments. If you're lucky to find somebody like that, that's good. But sometimes it's just try to surround yourself with really smart people who are really curious about things and are interested in talking to you. And then, you can talk to them over coffee or whatever you do, over lunch, talk about your ideas. That is enough. Most of the time, as a researcher, you're just all in it by yourself. It's unfortunate. It's a very lonely life. It's a very lonely life. But that's, because most of the time you're in your head. It's just the way it is, unfortunately. Yeah, so I don't have any, it's difficult. I find it very difficult to find people to give you honest and meaningful advice. Some people say, if you want to get advice, you just send it to a journal and they will give you advice. I don't think it's a good way to do, because you do have some sort of a reputation. Not everything is anonymous, and you don't want to build a bad reputation by sending your articles off to just to get feedback. To me, it's not a good way of doing it. Yeah, okay. Yeah, look, even the best researchers get rejections all the time. You have to have a really thick skin. And I know Ahmed has got enormous thick skin. He's amazing. He's so persistent. I mean, because of that, you know, he's got the characteristics of a true learner, a true scholar. You know, stick with him. You know, I don't know all of you, so I can't say anything about somebody else. What role does peer? Okay, that's the one I answered. Is there any other question? Sorry, no, that's about all the questions I think I have. Oh no, there's more questions. Can't see, I can't go further down. Yeah, what are the reasons that reject a thesis and research paper? I can tell you what is the rejection on a thesis. I've never had a thesis being rejected from any student of mine. And it is not because they write really well. If it's really bad, unfortunately, it's the purpose that it's often the supervisor has to fix it up. So I spend a lot of time rewriting thesis. So you should not get rejected. If you get rejected, then your supervisor must have chosen the wrong person. So for those theses which are not brilliant, because I can't guarantee brilliance from a student, I send it to the more easier markers. You know, at the end of the day, they've gone through the journey. You know, I'm not going to stop them. The key here is, of course, about whether or not you'll be successful afterwards. So a good research student writes a good thesis and is able to publish afterwards. Yeah, so the real test of truth, test of time, will be whether or not you can get papers published. Yeah, so I've not seen many theses being rejected. No. I think it's a rare occasion. Maybe Pakistan more, I don't know. What about the chapter? Sorry. What about the chapter including reference? I'm not sure what it means. It's from Huma. What about the chapter included the reference? What does it mean? Oh, sorry.
I think,
please ask.
Professor Peter, thank you very much for your wonderful session. I think we have a participant, Dr. Azhar. He is raising his hand to have a question. You can unmute, and if he has.
Oh, is there a mute? I'm not responsible for that. I didn't know that. More. How do I do that? Participants? No.
Yeah. Okay, I can ask.
It is unmute. It is unmuted.
Yes.
It is unmuted. So people have to unmute
themselves.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah. It's a simple question, but it's a real problem in our country, particularly, you know, like at the MS level. So my question is about the, when you do research, so one of the objectives by definition that your research should add some new knowledge to the existing body of knowledge. Okay. Now, if you do research and at the end of your research, you write your thesis, and if you've written a very wonderful thesis, you know, like there is coherence, there is interlinking, there is everything except one thing, that your thesis or your research does not add new knowledge to the existing body of knowledge. Do you think that the research degree should be awarded to such thesis? Yeah. Well, personally, I agree that it should not be awarded a degree. What do you think?
I think it's a wonderful question. And okay, I'll put the thing a bit lower. Sorry, now I can see myself now. Sorry about that. Sorry. Yeah, it's a great question. And I struggle. I'm really, really struggling with the universities, because what the university has become, it's become number crunching. You just get rid of all these people, get them in and get them finished. So the administrators have taken control over the process. And if you can't get a student finished, they put a bad mark on you. The problem, I agree with you 100%. These students should never have gone through the stages of the PhD. I don't know if you've got stages, but we have several stages they have to pass. They should never have gone past it. Look, to be completely honest, out of all my students, and I'm telling you something, I don't want you to tell somebody else, but out of all the students I've had, say 100 students, probably 20 deserve it. The others didn't. But, you know, they go back to the countries, and if you stop them, it will be a big mark or negative mark on their families. There are so many pressures. There are other stakeholders I have to worry about in terms of, you know, whether or not students should pass. It's not a simple thing like, okay, you didn't do enough contribution, so you shouldn't pass. Yes, in theory, yes, but in the real world, unfortunately, the university doesn't allow me to do so. And I guess it's the same in your university, same problem. Yeah, so I agree with you 100%. But the way I see it is, look, those students who didn't contribute much to the literature and haven't really thought a lot, yeah, probably badly written, they're probably unlikely to be successful and get a job. So that goes back to my point. If you can't think, you can't write, all the other things are not going to turn out very well in your life anyway. It's highly unlikely you're going to work at a university, and good, for good reasons, because how can they supervise others? And how can they do research? They're not going to be successful. So they're going to work in the real industry or in the outside world, and whatever they're going to do, they obviously don't need the same skills as the ones we're teaching students. But I agree with you 100%. I'm struggling with this problem every day. Trust me. I'm struggling with this conflict of interest. Yeah, I agree with you 100%. It's a really good question. But I don't know how you think about it.
Type of problem.
Hey? I don't know how you think about it, Ahmed.
Yeah, we
It's
all
a tough
are
one.
facing this type of political environment in the universities. There are a lot of people around us, non-professional people. But as I believe, when we can reject a thesis at the end of once it's completed, as I understand, it's not the place to reject the thesis. At this place of his proposal or initial stage, then we can give a tough time, we can give a lot of comments, then we can grill the student. After that, once building has been done, then we can demolish it. We can't demolish it. We can improve, we can polish it, we can fix the things in better way. But the point is, at the start, if we give them tough time to student about thinking and handling the all aspects of research, that will be much better, as I understand. But once it's completed, then I think we should be a bit lenient to improve the things.
The difficulty with that is, I agree with you. The difficulty is I don't have any control over the students coming into the university. The university tells you, these are the students from overseas, you have to take them on. It's not my choice. And we end up with a lot of students. There are other issues in Australia because most students coming here for visa, they don't come to learn PhD. Yes. They want to get, you know how it is. So we deal with more problems. But the unfortunate thing is a lot of the students, even though you train them in the beginning or you help them, they're not capable. They are not the right people who are coming here. That's the problem.
Yes, yes, yes. The will is important. How much you are having the will to learn the things, that is important.
Yeah, but I'm sure you have the same problem in Pakistan.
Yeah, we are having a worse situation here as well. Any participant having question, or we can close the session? Okay, I think we have done a wonderful job. Thank you very much, dear professor. It was a wonderful session, and hope it will facilitate our academicians as well as students to improve their research skills, and it's really constructive and productive one. Thank you very much for your time, and it's lovely to see you, because we are in since last, I think, 7 to 8 years, but we didn't talk.
Yeah, we should Zoom more often. We should Zoom more often. Yes. Really, because it's so easy to connect to each other. We can have some good conversation. Thank you very much for all the questions.
Thank you for your time. God bless you. Stay blessed.
Okay, enjoy yourself.